day a week. It is 365 days a year.
Well, good morning, everyone. It's a pleasure to have you, all of you here. We appreciate you taking your time to come in. Today we will have, as it was announced, a press conference with the Deputy General Director of the U.S. Division of the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, Johanna Tablada. She will provide an overview of the current state of the bilateral relation and will answer all the questions that you may have. After that, we will give the floor for your answers, and we will have a 40 minutes session for that. So say that, we have Johanna.
Can you hear me? Yeah. And at the end, if someone would like one specific question for your agency, I'll do it as well. Apart from what we speak, somebody will be interested. Daisy. I start talking to the Americans, and I forgot the most important, my Cuban girl. Nice to see you. We've been knowing each other for a long time, too. So we would like, I'm in Washington, D.C. I'm Johanna Tablada, as she mentioned. I'm the second of Deputy Minister Carlos Fernandez de Cosio in charge of the U.S. Division. And as you probably, I know that there are many issues that are important right now, apart from Cuba, that it's never a priority in U.S. foreign policy. But we really would like to highlight and to call some attention to what's going on U.S. policy toward Cuba, because we consider that the way that it's being driven, it is absolutely going into an scenario that could harm both Cuba and United States. The policy of the United States toward Cuba right now is deliberately directed to provoke starvation, economic hardship, to suffocate the Cuban population, to destabilize Cuba, and eventually to provoke a situation of either confrontation, direct confrontation or collision between U.S. and Cuba in any scenario, and with the risk of not reaching not even what the United States supposed to be main goal of regime change. So our vision, witnessing little by little how since January 20, United States government is, ¿cómo se dice? Apostando doble, double down on policy of maximum pressure, on policy of maximum aggression, with our experience in what happened before, when this has been the option, the results we consider that not necessarily will be the results that U.S. government or the people in the U.S. government that are taking care of the Cuban policy are necessarily promising to the public or to the president or to themselves, or to the special interest group that are pushing for this extreme scenario. This is something that it concerns Cubans, not just Cuban officials, but the Cuban population, and it looks pretty obvious for us that reinforcing the tools to suffocate the Cuban economy will probably trigger the same result than last time during the first term of Trump. It triggers the historic massive migration, the record-broken number of migrants from Cuba to U.S. It happened already between 2019 and 2024. Almost 1 million Cubans coming to U.S. It doesn't match any of the previous migratory waves of Cubans. And somebody could think now, well, but the border is closed. U.S. government is not granting parole anymore, because when you look at how was possible that 1 million Cubans came to U.S., it was a combination of push effects that we do recognize in a deliberate effort to create hardships and suffocate the Cuban economy of the source of income for the Cuban population, and pull effects. We have the Cuban Adjustment Act that will grant a privileged treatment for Cubans coming to U.S. Now the privileges are gone. And in fact, what we are watching is the threat of that thousands of people that were legally admitted in U.S. are being threatened to be sent back home or even to third countries. But the pushing efforts of putting pressure on people that live in an island in order for them to behave the way that the U.S. Secretary of State has modeled without any serious evidence in the real life. So we do consider that at some point we are trying to call the attention this week that we are going to meet counterparts in the United States of different sectors to try to call the attentions of people that are not paying attention in what's going on with policy on Cuba, to take a look at what's really going on and try to take U.S. policy from the area of fiction to the real track of real life. And why do I say that is the area of fiction? The pretexts that have been fabricated every day as fake news in order to fuel that narrative that Cuba is an enemy. I'm going to start quoting what the U.S. government or State Department highest officials are saying. Cuba is an enemy of humanity. It's not true. In Dominican Republic, when he said that in front of press, a periodista said, bájele, bájele. He said, please, don't tell that to us. No, like, say that in the Senate, but not here. Cuba is a sponsor of terrorism. It took 6 hours for the new government to put back Cuba in the list of supposed state sponsoring terrorism without going not even an inch of the process that took exactly, or that drive the government to take exactly the opposite decision, who was the interagency process of certifying that Cuba was not sponsoring terrorism. And 6 days later, suddenly, for politically reasons, Cuba is again in the so-called terrorist list without any of the national security agencies to present in evidence of that things. The other thing we are witnessing is the comeback of the more less diplomatic meddling into internal or domestic affairs of Cuba. The United States is very sensitive to any foreign government to do meddling operation into their domestic affairs, but has no remorse or any scrupulous to go ahead and launch the most open intervention and interference in the domestic affairs of Cuba, trying to incite and give incentive to Cubans that already have been benefit from USAID programs that, by the way, I'm going to make a parenthesis to say that in the case of Cuba, I mean, U.S. withdraw money from UNICEF, from vaccines in Africa, from building of roads in Central America, from healthcare programs or AIDS program. But in the case of the Cuba or the anti-Cuban programs, it's the most robust, how do you say it correctly? Robust that the U.S. government has right now. So everybody has been, again, connected to the millions of dollars that former USAID, and now I think it's USAID, but under a new boss, everybody are getting back their funds. National Endowment for Democracy is spending right now $6.6 million in Cuba, or in Cuba regime change programs. And this is the most, the biggest budget that is being delivered right now in the Western Hemisphere, any countries. I know that Venezuela, Cuba, and Nicaragua are the target of most of those regime change programs, but it's interesting to find out that it is Cuba, the one that is receiving the maximum, which I will translate into wasting of taxpayers' money, because it doesn't reach the goal of toppling the Cuban Revolution, but definitely I don't think also that has been successful in reframing the debate. United Nations continue to condemn the U.S. embargo every year with only 2 governments opposing the Cuban resolution, United States and Israel. Latin America reject recent attempt by the State Department to go and expel Cuban medical brigades cooperation agreements. It was massively rejected by prime ministers, minister of healthcare. So I don't think there was any success either in that attempt. Basically because it wasn't true that it's a human trafficking operation. It is not true that they don't receive salaries. In fact, they receive double in Cuba and abroad. It doesn't true that it doesn't operate under the same conditions than local doctors. And that was very well explained by the leaders of the Caribbean very recently. So I think that it's not the same to create an atmosphere of fiction in the U.S. Senate and then to go out to the real world and recognize that Cuba is a country that is respected, that the Cuban international medical collaboration is widely respected and it's preventing people to suffer from illness. It is also legal in the framework, within the framework of United Nations South-South cooperation framework. In the case of bilateral relation, I would like to report to you that the United States has adamantly refused every single diplomatic note, every single conversation, and every single attempt and offer from the Cuban government since January 20, ignoring any offer from our side to have talks to the United States. The more recent and obvious evidence was that migration talk has been suspended. At the same time, I have to say that Cuba continue operating under the framework of our migratory agreement with the United States. We continue respecting the migration agreements. We continue protecting our border in order to prevent people from living illegally or in an irregular way. We continue to work for regular, safe migration and preventing irregular migration. But United States policy and the designation of Cuba, the fraudulent designation of Cuba, and the so-called SSOT list is increasing the economic hardships, and it's increasing also the potential for people that would like to migrate from Cuba, as it happened before. The narrative about the human right, we consider that is a narrative that it has huge contradiction, that it shows, it remains a new level of hypocrisy, because you cannot be going after every day in a medieval prosecution of oil shipments to Cuba. So you cannot put in every day on a map that this vessel, Cuba is buying oil or fuel to illuminate Cuban households, to produce our goods, to transport our population, and at the same time, you will have the narrative that look at Cuba, how bad they're going. They have apagones, they have blackouts. Of course we'll have blackouts. If there are 54 vessels in the world that are sanctioned by the United States just because doing a legitimate operation of selling food or transport food to an island of 10 million people, it has to be some impact. Or they will say they are not, the hospitals are not anymore what it used to be. Everybody knows how much seriously Cuba invests in a universal free healthcare system that has been applauded international by the World Health Organization, and also by countries, including the United States. So there's a lot of double standard when you are doing everything possible in order to threat the integrity of an entire population, and at the same time you are proclaiming in the United States and elsewhere that the situation of the Cuban people is very bad, that we have a failed state, and I understand what's going on, and everybody, I think, in Cuba, or most of the population in Cuba and elsewhere, are understanding that the game is to wreak havoc into the Cuban economy, to starve the Cuban population if possible, to scare off any possible investment in Cuba, to reinforce the extraterritorial impact of the embargo, and at the same time to blame the victim. So they will say, look how bad they are doing. But the entire operation is precisely designed to provoke this situation. Apart from that, we've seen all sorts of provocations in order for Cuba to stop cooperating in immigration, not just by suspending the migratory talks, but by other actions and accusations and false narratives such as military Chinese base in Cuba, or Cuban intervention in Latin America, or Cuba as a threat of national security threat to Latin America. It is important to set the record straight, and I'm going to wrap up my presentation and speak about things that are of your specific interest, but it is important to say and remind that there is not, and I even went this morning to artificial intelligence and said that I believe in our own social communication, but I start asking different tools since in Cuba they are not available because recently the Secretary of State put Cuba in a list of arbitrary nations, which the immediate impact that our students, our professors, our diplomats, our population will not have access to some of the best platform of artificial intelligence. So since I have the liberty of doing that here because in Cuba, it's not Cuba who is preventing, it's U.S. government that is preventing us to access today to more than 200 applications in internet. It is important that they say there is not an evidence that there is a single measures that reciprocate the hundreds and hundreds of unilateral coercive measures of the United States against Cuba. So how long would that go on? We don't know. We would love to call the attention for more oversight, public oversight in the United States to the Cuba policy. Because again, Cuba policy, it looks to be freely on the hands of a special interest group that has profited precisely in building on preventing U.S. and Cuba to have a normal relation, in prohibiting Americans to visit Cuba, in prohibiting Cubans to visit America, in prohibiting people-to-people travel, in going after universities to drop their contracts with Cuban university, in prohibiting our science institutions to collaborate with American science institutions, in prohibiting many things that in a state that's supposed to be the totalitarian state, such as Cuba in the U.S. narrative, will be the one that will be preventing all sorts of things from happening, and not the country of the United States. Finally, I would like to say that if we are here, and Deputy Carlos Fernandez de Corsillo came in January, at least as far as we are granted visas, we would like to reinforce, which is the mission of the Cuban Embassy in the United States. The mission of the Cuban Embassy in the United States is to improve relations with the United States. The mission of our visit to the United States is to continue looking forward for reinforcing the ties, the historical ties, cultural ties, political ties that have put Cuba and the United States in the same neighborhood. We enjoy having a relationship with the United States. Americans enjoy visiting Cuba. Cuban Americans living in Miami or in New Jersey or in California or elsewhere in the country, what statistics are showing is that just that they love to visit their country, that they like to help their relatives, but are the only immigrants in the United States that has been received a discriminatory treatment. Cubans already lose the capacity to send money home through Western Union because among the 14, I won't list the 14 measures. If you're interested, I could send with Zulia our list. But from January 20 to today, Cuba already, apart from the 200 measures that President Biden unfairly and unfortunately keep running against Cuba from Trump's first time, have taken at least 14 additional new measures in order to wreak havoc, in order to dynamite our relation, to really provoke a rupture of relation, and even to create conditions, in my opinion, for if necessarily, a military confrontation. The group that is in charge of Cuba policy in 2019 proposed a naval blockade against Cuba. And I don't want to scare anybody, but I would like the press to be more interested in finding out which are the real purpose of doing the same, but even worse than last time when they provoked a situation that infant mortality rate in Cuba went down went up from 4 to 7 in a very short period of time, that a lot of people decided to abandon their business, including private sector, to emigrate because they saw no hope of improvement of relations. When United States went to South America and Central American officials, they speak about investment, they speak about increasing the standard of living of the population to prevent them to emigrate. How is it that in the case of Cuba, the narrative exactly the opposite, that you wanted to deteriorate the condition? We will continue to work with the U.S. The Cuban official position is that we would like to have better relations. We would like to open a respectful dialogue with President Trump. We would like to discuss issues in a serious way, apart from the fake news, apart from the fake pretense, apart from the fake narrative. Thank you very much for devoting some time to come and talk to us this morning. I'm open to any questions.
Yes, thank you, Johanna. And we will start with Ted Hesson from Reuters, please.
Thank you, Director. Cuba recently issued a verbal warning to the U.S. Chief of Mission, Mike Hammer, over incidents in which it said Hammer was inciting Cuban citizens to commit crimes during his travels across the island. Will Cuba expel Hammer? And if he's asking citizens to commit crimes, when does he cross the line that would lead Cuba to expel him?
Well, I think that there is a deliberate effort from the State Department for Cuba to have to reply to things that are not tolerable, not in Cuba, but on any issue, on any country. In the United States, they were about even to go to an impeachment process for the suspect that a foreign government was meddling into U.S. domestic policy. What the Charge of Affairs of the United States in Cuba is doing is violating the Article 41 of the Vienna Convention. We've told them so at least 4 times. He openly are asking people to go to the street. He openly are channeling money from the USAID programs that are back in motion in Cuba for regime change. He's talking to people that are in business. By the way, many of them, I think, have rejected those claims because he has immunity. But the people that he's asking to commit crime has no immunity to violate the law. So it's like desperate. About the decision of Cuba to what to do with that behavior, I understand that we've been more responsible because we consider that the relations between U.S. and Cuba doesn't belong to the Charge of Affairs. It belongs to the people of Cuba and the people of the United States. So as far as we can continue denouncing, trying to talk, using all diplomatic ways in order to prevent to cross the line, but I cannot anticipate what would be the next step if the United States continue to escalate in doing what they openly know that they will not allow any officials of a foreign nation to do in U.S. Here is our Charge of Affairs. She just arrived, Ambassador Lianis, and you will never find her delivering money because we don't have budgets to overthrow the U.S. government or talking people about things that we would like to see changing in U.S. We recognize that it rightfully belongs to the U.S. people to decide what happened here with health care. We prefer free health care or universal health care. We consider that insurances probably are not the best way for dealing with health care, but this is our opinion. It is not for us to go out and do lobby like U.S. is doing in Cuba for groups of people to do it the American way or to topple their government. We will never do that. I can assure you that we will never do that. Our diplomats have a prohibition of intervening in domestic affairs, and they have a duty to continue working as we've been doing for many years without reciprocating coercive measures, because we consider that it will trigger a spiral of confrontation that is precisely the one that irresponsible people. But what I should tell you is that the way that we are looking, the U.S. is escalating in this, will not end well, or it has very few possibilities of end well. For one way, because U.S. already proved its lack of power to decide for the Cuban people. So the resilience of the Cuban people to continue defending their right, their sovereignty, their independence, and our right to build a social justice society that's with whatever the problems that we have, and we don't blame all the problems to the U.S. blockade. We have our own things, but it is up to us to solve it. But if you look at the evolution of U.S. policy and domestic issues in Cuba, in the last year, you'll see a country that continue evolving, responding to the demands of the population. We changed our constitution. We changed our family code. We opened the country for more human rights. We've been opening our policy to nationals that live abroad, and it's very normal today to have Cubans dancing in an event in a theater, participating in our life, participating in the economy. And on the other way, you see this weird behavior that it is domination or nothing, or conquer or nothing, hegemony or nothing. And those policies has no future. The resilience of the Cuban people to face again another wave of coercive measures or wars is present, is strong, and it has the support of our population. But I consider that if the American people honestly will know which are the tools that the United States government are using in order to prevail in the whim and in the wishes of a small group of people that are powerful but small, or a company like Bacardi could change the property or trademark law in the United States, I think they won't like it. They won't like it that a small group, and I'm not talking of Cuban Americans. Cubans, Americans are being badly harmed by the current policy too. They are being intimidated in order for them not to visit Cuba. They are being intimidated with retaliation by Congressman Carlos Jimenez, that if they go to Cuba, they might lose their residence. They are being intimidated, the ones that are selling to our private sector in Cuba, that if they continue to sell to Cuba, they could lose those licenses. So what we are watching has no precedent, both in the suffering of the Cuban people, that has to have a limit, that is absurd or cruel, for a population that loves the United States, that like the American people, that welcome you when you visit Cuba as friends, and that someone else has to jump into the pool of Cuba policy, or at least to start doing the right question that no one asked Mike Hammer when he went to Miami last week and proclaimed that he was speaking on behalf of the Cuban people, which is, it just reminds us the time of the colonial time, or the times where the American ambassador was the second man in Cuba. Those times are gone forever. I understand and recognize that there are people in the United States that still have difficulty accepting that Cuba doesn't belong to the United States, or that Cuba is an independent country, but they really have to cope with reality at some point. So my short answer to your question is that we will continue trying to prevent United States meddling into our domestic affairs. But we won't necessarily do what Marco Rubio has planned, because Marco Rubio is not the Secretary of State of Cuba. It's Bruno Rodriguez.
Karen de Jong from the Washington Post.
Could you tell us what the current situation is about deportations? I know Cuba was accepting some deportation flights. You said that the migration under the Trump administration. Do you anticipate that there are going to be deportation flights, and would Cuba them?
Thank you, Karen. This is a very important question. Most of the people in the United States doesn't know that since 2017 that we signed the last migratory agreement, what we call Declaración Conjunta, 55 flights of deportation arrived to Cuba. If you add the people that are being returned trying to emigrate by sea, we are talking of almost 50,000 Cubans that has been returned to Cuba in well-organized operations between U.S. government and Cuban government as part of our migratory agreement. So we are talking of orderly, safe, coordinated procedures for people that came back to Cuba and continue their life in Cuba. But the people that came back are the people that are in the categories that has been discussed in the migratory. The other thing that people in the United States doesn't know is that even with Trump, whose first decision in office was to unfairly put back Cuba in the so-called state sponsor of terrorism to please a few members of his cabinets, and I don't want to elaborate. Let me go back to Europe. But even when the first action of the new government were very hostile, and the second and the third, even when there were weeks that I remember the United States announced 3 and 4 measures. By the way, most of those decisions have been announced Friday afternoon at 9, so that you won't realize it, that is going on. It's just Miami and Cuba, the one that we realize. Half of them hasn't been even announced. They put it in a deep note, or they will return as they did a few weeks ago, 40 passports, saying that they won't allow the Cuban soccer team to play in U.S., that they would not allow the Cuban students of the National School of Art to participate in a contest. 30 young people were rejected. They wouldn't allow the president of the Olympic Committee of Cuba, Leon Richard, to participate in 2 important international meetings in the United States. That was last week. How is it that Cuba, that is one of the most outstanding sport nations in the Western Hemisphere, at the beginning of an Olympic cycle that will end up in Los Angeles, will be prevented from attending meetings, games? This is going on and nobody's paying attention. That's why we're here. So the other thing, Karen, going back to your question, that people doesn't know is that even despite of so many maximum aggressive actions by the new Secretary of State, Cuba already accepted and continue accepted 1 flight per month, as we did with President Biden. So from January 20 to today, every month, a plane from United States landed in Cuba according to the same procedures that another 50 arrive with President Biden every month. So when I tell you that Cuba is the adult in the room, I'm not exaggerating. So I don't know if they're going to close again the consular office in Havana. We don't know if they will finally please a member of Congress that is representing a few donors and not the Cuban community when he wants to cancel 100 flights that the United States depart from U.S. every week to Cuba, to move Americans that travel under the categories that they want to eliminate again, or people that will visit relatives that are sick, or that grandmothers that will help a daughter for the birth of the new baby. They are already preventing Cubans to visit U.S. to assist an ill person. You have to go to a third country. And the overwhelming majority of the case, they won't grant the visas. So the answer is yes, we continue to accept the Coast Guard's people that return with the Coast Guard by the port of Cabañas in Mariel. And yes, last Friday, we received the 5th flight during President Trump's government. It is not a gesture specific to this government. It's a continuity of the fulfillment of our agreement that apart from all the provocations, the meddling, the monies for toppling the Cuban government, the disrespectful narrative of an ambassador that will be in foreign territory representing, in fact, you know what I think? That he doesn't represent the government of Cuba, as my minister said the other day in a message in X, but he said he doesn't even represent the Americans. Because we had this year 400 Americans for the jazz festival, 200 Americans for the dancing festival. Last week there were an international event in the Havana universities, and people that attend from the Foreign Affairs Ministry to a workshop in Latin America said there were a lot of scholars of America. So what is natural between U.S. and Cuba is the engagement, is what we want, is what the U.S. people want. What it is artificial and worse, costly, is a waste of money, is to take away money for vaccine to children in the third world and put it into the regime change groups that are the friends of the people that are controlling Cuba policy today. They need General Accounting Office to look into that, and nobody will be surprised of what they will find in terms of saving and protecting the taxpayer money. And the other thing that is an inconsistency is that if this is a priority of this government is to prevent illegal, irregular immigration, then you won't go and twisted the neck of a country that you already have a knee on their neck in order to make it worse, because the most likely thing is that there will be a migratory crisis. That is the plan of Jimenez. He wants a migratory crisis, he already said publicly, and a military intervention. But another inconsistency will come there, because apparently the priority of the government of the United States today is not to waste millions and millions and millions of dollars in wasteless regime change programs that have proved to not succeed, and it's not to take two countries that would like to live in peace to military confrontation so that someone would like to be president.
Have you already seen an increase in departures, either by sea or people flying to Managua or however they get out?
I don't have the latest statistic. I think that the southern border, there is a decrease precisely because of the policy of this government, in order not to allow what they allowed before, like the parole or the different categories that President Biden put in place. But what we are trying to walk 3 meters more is what these people are calling. I mean, when I'm talking of these people, again, I'm not talking of the overwhelming majority of Cubans, but the political machinery that has a piñata of federal funds and would like to see our two countries in all sorts of confrontations, if they enforce their plan, we'll see. I'm sure that there will be no way to prevent people to try to live as they always have done in situations like this, on raft, and it is difficult for a country that has no fuel to have at its maximum capacity our Coast Guard to prevent Cubans leaving. And at some point, you also have to think that Cuba is not masochist, that we have been continued to showing goodwill because we consider that there is no enough attention in what's going on between U.S. and Cuba, and because we consider that the best thing is to do the right thing. But at a moment of maximum tension, I'm not sure if Cuba will continue to have to get the flights. Because at some point, try to place yourself in the boots of Cuba. So if you are going to cancel flights to all provinces, if you're going to punish viejitos to visit Guantanamo or Santiago de Cuba to see their relative, if you already cancel remittances, if you're talking about canceling sales to Cuba, even from the people in Florida that has links, economic links or commercial links with Cuba, if you're really going to go nuclear, I mean, I'm talking in figure sense, but when you talk about going to the maximum, the other day, Mauricio Claver-Caron spoke and said that there was the maximum pressure was even at a 50%. This is not true. As a Cuban, with 10 days, 10 hours of blackout, if this is not maximum pressure as a Cuban that spend 8 hours to go to work as a nurse to a hospital, or people that for the first time has to suffer the humiliation or having to split a pill into 2 patients because Cuba is not producing it anymore because U.S. already blackmailed the bank. Because what they're doing right now is going after every country, every bank, every enterprise. There's a silent pressure that we are feeling because our embassies are reporting it to us to finish medical collaboration that not just save life in the Amazonia or in Latin America or in Africa, it also helped the Cuban national healthcare system to function, to buy cytostatics, to make our incubators work. All of these things are being tested by the so-called maximum pressure, which is almost a genocide, pre-genocide measures. And this kind of people will stop at nothing. Carlos Jimenez already made an audience on the hearing and talks publicly in the social communication about intervention every time that he has a chance. So we hope that the Americans and the Cuban Americans will recover the capacity to have a say in Cuba policy. It shouldn't belong to a person that already proved that they will be able to take reckless measures that will harm U.S. people and the Cuban people, but that will harm also U.S. national interests and Cuban national interests.
Okay, Ryan Chua from Bloomberg, please.
Yes, 2 parts to my question. First, can you tell us more about those instances when your efforts to re-engage with the administration were ignored? And the second part is, so what are you doing currently to ease tensions and build better ties?
Well, the first thing that I think to ease tension is that we haven't reciprocated the very hostile power of shooting of this government against Cuba every day, actions and narrative. In all fields, internationally, extraterritoriality, in their embassy in Cuba that is doing nothing but representing the U.S. people. So this is, I think, is a way of easing tensions. If you won't do what they expect you to do, mi suegra, my mother-in-law, used to tell me when I had a discussion with her son that you need 2 to fight. Same thing, you take 2 to tango. But she will say, if someone is mad in a conversation and the other one doesn't engage in the same behavior, at some point you're easing tension. No? That was a good advice for my mother-in-law, and it worked. So you expect that moment of aggressive rhetoric to stop. You do diplomatic notes explaining things so that people cool down and read. We've sent lots of diplomatic notes to the United States with our positions, which used to be U.S. position on issues of common concern. I have to report that we haven't been successful, but at the same time, it could get worse. So that's why we are going public into our call for more public, responsible scrutiny. ¿Cómo se dice? Scrutiny. Scrutiny into what's going on. Because we do know that they won't stop in order to get away with their idea. At the same time, we do know that they will fail in their main objective, which is to topple the Cuban Revolution, to impose a government that responds to U.S., but what we are trying to prevent is the suffering. The high toll that the Cuban population is paying to please, or just because there are someone that would like to please and pandering to a special interest group that is already very richful, because the rest of the United States cannot visit Cuba, cannot trade with Cuba, cannot invest in Cuba, cannot engage with Cuba. Hello, if 65 years is not enough, tell me another number. The U.S. embargo is the longest, more comprehensive system of unilateral coercive measures of the world. It's very cruel, is doing harm, is not working for toppling the Cuban government. I don't think it will work. I'm sure it won't work, but it's hurting people of both sides. And I think that we have to give it a try. Not to mention that already in the very ephemeris time when U.S. and Cuba went the other way, immediately, it was successful. Immediately, it collected overwhelming support from people in U.S., in Florida, and in Cuba. Immediately increased the standard of living of the Cubans, and immediately create an atmosphere when U.S. and Cuba signed 22 agreements, when we start talking even about nationalizations, claims, compensation, human rights, issues also that are on U.S. agenda together with ours. So for an official like ours, some of us have been here once, 2, 3 times in different missions, permanent or temporarily, there's no doubt that when Cubans and Americans sit down, always something positive came out of that conversation. That's why the political brokers of this relation that happen now to be in charge again of U.S.-Cuba policy would like to cut all sorts of ties. And I think that would be very unfair. I think the United States people and Cuban Americans will have to have a say in something that it will have a tremendous damage and consequence that right now we cannot prevent, but definitely to push both countries into scenarios of confrontation and collision is not a good idea. It's not going to end well.
Daisy Francis from Prensa Latina.
Claro, mi amor. Para nada. Intacta. La disposición de Cuba a mantener un diálogo con Estados Unidos se mantiene intacta. Es más, hoy es una disposición más importante que nunca. Cuba y Estados Unidos deberían estar hablando hoy de la temporada de huracanes que comienza. ¿Lo puedo hablar en inglés o tú lo quieres en español? Ya, español, después lo digo en inglés. Lo digo cortico en inglés. Cuba y Estados Unidos deberían estar conversando hoy de la temporada de huracanes. La NOAA trabaja con las instituciones de meteorología cubana para cuidar a la población de Estados Unidos y de la población cubana. Cuba y Estados Unidos deberían estar hablando de la navegación aérea, de la seguridad de sus aeropuertos. Cuba y Estados Unidos deberían seguir cooperando contra el tráfico de drogas, contra el tráfico de inmigrantes, a favor del medio ambiente, contra el lavado de dinero. La agenda entre Cuba y Estados Unidos que hemos desarrollado en años pasados es amplia y robusta y positiva, y pudiera ser todavía mucho más amplia. Esa es la posición de Cuba. Pero Cuba sí no va a permitir que Estados Unidos avance en su interés de intervenir en los asuntos internos de Cuba y avance en su interés de recuperar la dominación de Cuba. So I'll tell you in English, she was asking me if our willingness to continue talking to the United States is remain even when the Sharjah affair is behaving in a hostile way, public hostile way. And I say that, of course, yes, it's intact, because Cuba would like to talk to U.S. right now about just the season of hurricane. You know that every season of hurricane, U.S. hurricane hunter planes have to enter Cuba. That needs the procedures. We always say yes. That information that is gathered on the sky of Cuba then is delivered for our region in the Caribbean. Cuba and U.S. should be talking about narcotic interdiction that we've done with tremendous result. We should be talking of migration interdiction in making migration safe, orderly, and regular. We should be talking about environment. We should be working together like we did in the past in expeditions to see the birds that come and sleep in U.S. and then in Cuba and continue to South America. We should be waiting in oil spill to prevent accidents. All of those things that I'm saying are not science fiction. All of those things are issues that are in the framework of bilateral agreements that are extremely positive, mutually rewarding, positive, that this government put them in a refrigerator. Those are the things that reflect the real interests of U.S. and Cuba, not the science fiction narrative about Cuba being the most terrorist of the world when U.S. is praising terrorists, real terrorists in other areas, or not the science fiction that China is colonizing Cuba when China has a much more robust relationship today in terms of business, trade, investment with the United States like the one that it has with Cuba. Apart from the fact that Cuba has the right to have the kind of relation with China that we want, and we have a positive one with China. And we will continue to have a positive, very good relationship with China. In fact, the only foreign military base, as you know, that there is in Cuba, it doesn't belong to China, it belongs to the United States, and is there against the will of the Cuban people.
Anyone else? Yes, that.
Thank you. Ted Hessen with Reuters. You mentioned the hurricane chasers. Is that effort still going on now, or has it been paused? What's the status of it, and are you still collaborating with the U.S.?
I honestly, I might be wrong, but I think that will continue because it's a need from NOAA. And again, as we don't consider that Secretary of State Marco Rubio will have the last say in U.S. policy toward Cuba, or at least on Cuba policy toward U.S., because he probably could have the last say in invading Cuba if he wants to, but not in preventing Cuba to work with NOAA. So if the diplomatic note about a hurricane chaser comes to us because the plane needs to enter into Cuba airspace, I could anticipate that we'll say yes again. We value the relationship that we've been building up with the United States for such a long time, despite the historic also pretensions of different U.S. government to say the last say in Cuba. We do want to continue betting to a mutually respectful, mutually rewarding relationship, both official and people to people.
Another question? That's all?
I have no words to thank you for being here. Even if your editors won't publish a word, I thank you for the time that you spent with us. And feel free always to contact Zulia or Ambassador Lianis. When next time Carlos Jimenez said that Cuba is launching an attack against Key West or whatever, please call Cuba first. We will provide evidence and narrative and our vision, because we are living in really difficult times when perceptions are realities. And in the case of Cuba, the perceptions that are being spread out are absolutely fabrications.
An extra interview with someone else, Johanna will be available. So thank you, and you're welcome to be in contact with us.